Thank you for the introduction, Hannah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to be here this morning to talk with you, and I suppose inevitably we're going to be talking about successful women and what that takes. So I'd like to just start by a couple of disclaimers. I'm not a person that's combated some major illness or disadvantage in life, but when my dad died at 14, I did realise the responsibility of providing for the family would probably land on my shoulders sooner rather than later, and I suspect that encouraged me to think in an entrepreneurial way. I'm also not sure that my message is particular to just women. I wanted to talk with you about what I've learned in the past few years working in sustainability and business and share that with you, but most of it really isn't about being a woman. However, I'll let you all be the judge of that. That said, I have benefited immensely from being a woman, and my fellow co-founder and managing director of Power Ledger, Dave Martin, often jokes that in 2018 he'd like to have been a woman, or at least some exotic sexuality, because he felt that it could bring some significant benefit in today's day and age. Another disclaimer is that while I am your successful woman this morning, and you can measure that in a certain number of ways, like speaking engagements, followers on social media, crypto token worth, I actually feel like I haven't done anything yet, that I'm not yet genuinely successful. At Power Ledger, we haven't yet scaled up the models from pilot projects and our first commercial deployments. There's still people in places like Puerto Rico without resilient and affordable electricity supply. Everyone here in this room and in Australia is still being charged far too much for their electricity, and also not being offered a market price for the electricity they produce for things like battery source power. I'm a person trying to become successful, and that makes me no different from you really. So the big project is still work in progress, and we've so much to do and a certain time pressure to do it in. That's why the gender of our next hire isn't really of ultimate importance. It is important, but the most important thing is how that person helps us deliver on the projects and what we're up to. The project's success is way more important than the gender of the people creating it. And I guess that's my first message to you. You need to find a project where success is more important than the concerns that could bring it down. Why do I say this to you? Because there will be times and there will be concerns aplenty, many of them petty, and if they're bigger than what's at stake for the project, the concerns will overwhelm the project and the project will die. You want it to be the other way around, where the project outshines the concerns. For example, the future of energy production is more important than falling out on whether the logo is emerald green or blue. Now, if you haven't got a big project, that does not mean you're a petty person, it just means you haven't conceived a big enough project. It's also possible that there is a bigger project lurking inside a smaller project. Some of you may know that Facebook started off as an app for Harvard alumni to keep in touch with each other. Its applicability to the outside world only became evident a little bit later. Sometimes the potential of a project only really becomes clear once you begin working on it. There's a story about Michael Faraday, who basically invented the world's first electrical generator. At the time, there wasn't even an electric light bulb, so he had this little demo armature, and he could move it and make some electricity, which basically made a little needle move. He was very pleased with this, and he showed it to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer of the UK, William Gladstone. After seeing the demo, Gladstone says, "Very good, Mr. Faraday, but what the devil's use is it?" And Faraday says, "I've absolutely no idea, but one day you'll be taxing it." To some extent, there are parallels with our energy project. It's possible to have a strong idea without really understanding or being able to deliver its full potential from the outset. But there does need to be an idea, which, like Faraday, you have an urge to show and tell people about. A big concept provides the motive for you and the project and the people around you. So for me, it's the most powerful way to success. So the question is, where do you get a big idea from? In my case, it didn't come immediately, but after a certain struggle of trying to solve a number of smaller problems. I want to tell you a little bit about how the idea came into being. About 10 years ago, I was working in a big bank in London. Perhaps unlike the stereotypical banker though, I had a passion for sustainability. Growing up in a farm outside Perth, I had a strong connection to nature. Then during my time in banking, I did a leadership training course, and as a part of that, I was asked to do a project. I looked around the office and saw there were no recycling facilities, and I decided to do something about it. It started as a small project on leadership, but became one that actually changed the trajectory of my life. I set about introducing recycling facilities into the bank's London offices. Into the bank's London offices, which employed 9,000 people and was set across 6 buildings. After the shared recycling bins arrived, I saw people putting all their rubbish in their small bin under their desk rather than the big recycling bin at the end of the aisle of desks. This made me pretty mad. So I set up phase 2 of the project called Bin the Bin. I got rid of all the bins that were under people's desks and put rubbish bins at the end of the aisle of desks next to the recycling bins to force people to get up to throw away their rubbish or recycling. I was jolly well going to make them go green. This was about to become my first big lesson in life. Without the hearts and minds, you can't do very much. Compliance and regulation by themselves are weak. You can't force anyone to do anything. The rate of recycling did go up, but it had an unintended consequence. Overnight, I became the most hated person in the bank. And when you think bankers rate somewhere below real estate agents and long-lens paparazzi, I wasn't feeling very good about this. And here it definitely did not help being a woman. I think it probably added to the feeling of being bossy. Some people at work started a Facebook page called Bring the Bins Back. And I was blamed for rats in the office. It became a fight about time. There were people that said they were so busy making money for the bank that they didn't have time to put their rubbish in the bin. So we said we'd put the bins on the way to the toilet. And then they said they were so busy making money for the bank that they didn't have time to go to the toilet. Actually, that's practically the definition of unsustainability, when you're too busy making money to even attend to your bodily functions. The Chief Operating Officer overruled them and said they wouldn't behave like this at home, so the system is staying. But I discovered an important question. How do you incentivise people rather than coerce them to do the things that we know are good for us all? Because coercion is such hard work, and who really wants to be seen as bossy? I told myself the Lao Tzu quote, "The longest journey starts with the smallest step," but even getting someone to go the small step to the bathroom was proving quite tricky. Despite the challenges that this project threw up, I thought the area of work was way more interesting than my day job in risk. I decided to study sustainability and started a postgraduate diploma and later a master's on the subject. As luck would have it, it was about this time that banks were realising the importance of looking at their lending and financing activities in developing countries from an environmental and social risk perspective. The bank that I worked in decided to set up an environmental and social risk management office, and I was chosen to help set up the team. But I also realised that if this was the resistance to change in the bank around simply recycling, just think what it was going on with extractive industries, chemicals, and clients who wanted to keep sidestepping regulation, tipping, externalising and dumping slag waste and toxins. Of course the bank wanted to improve things, but the system, the expectations, the client's value chain were all maintaining the status quo, just like my colleagues who are defiantly keeping their bins. This was long before Facebook and tech came into the firing line. Back then, the focus was on extractives, people pulling stuff out of the ground, and the social, environmental, and cultural compliance risk that those actions generated. The kinds of issues we face defy any one picture, but I think these pictures say quite a lot. None of these were actually generated by MyBank, but this was the kind of nightmare scenario for any of our clients doing big mining and chemical projects, and they were very much on my personal and professional radar, theoretically. Certainly the work that we did made an impact, but it wasn't as much as I had hoped for. I said earlier that I'd never had to deal with much of a crisis in my life, but this was as close as I'd come. I felt the sheer pointlessness of what my job entailed. Having just finished my Masters in Sustainability and quite tired, and I suppose on the same theme of big journeys and smaller steps, I decided I would go on a 900-kilometre walk across Spain, the Camino de Santiago. I'd originally decided to have a sabbatical and then relocate from London to Sydney or Melbourne, where all the banking jobs were. While plodding my way across Spain, fueled by red wine, and vaguely expecting some kind of spiritual awakening, other ideas popped into my head and they wouldn't disappear. I decided to do some more hiking and traverse the Himalayas, Nepal, Israel, the Andes, and Patagonia. The same idea persisted. I became obsessed with the idea of building an eco-village in Perth. And 7 months later, I decided to return home to Perth instead of Sydney or Melbourne and see what might come of this idea. A friend of mine who'd done a PhD persuaded me that if I did a PhD, it would better inform the design of my project. I applied for a PhD at Curtin and a scholarship with the CRC for low carbon living. It was applied research. During my doctorate, I realised that there were lots of houses with solar electricity, but no apartments with solar, which is about 1/3 of the housing stock in Australia, and a massive opportunity in roof space and therefore kilowatts. I also discovered that the law governing these buildings meant that they could sell electricity to residents without a retail electricity licence, and I got quite excited about that. I stuck my head into lots of data. I found when aggregating demand profile for more than 15 apartments over the course of the year, the low profiles were more predictable and therefore solar panels got more commercial and there were the economies of scale. I persuaded the government land developer Landcorp to create a microgrid with batteries and solar in apartments as a demonstration project for what's possible. This is a project called WQV in Whiteman Valley, near Fremantle, and it's a first of its kind. But there was one unresolved problem with solar in apartment buildings, and it's one of incentives. Many apartments are tenanted, and there's nothing in it for the landlord who would invest in photovoltaics and batteries. Economists call this the principal agent problem or the split incentive problem. Basically, landlords don't want to invest because someone else, in this case the tenant, gets the benefit of lower or free electricity, not them. And on the other hand, tenants don't want to invest in solar because the payback period exceeds the length of their tenancy agreement. The important question wasn't a technical one, but an economic one. How do you transmit the benefits of the investment to the investor? Another issue I grappled with was that for owner-occupied properties who are given an allocation of electricity based on how much of the microgrid that they own, they weren't rewarded properly for using less. You would really need to allow people to sell their allocation unused onto someone else. So there were more incentives issues. And it became clear to me what was needed, a way of delivering the right incentives communicated via an internal market simply and clearly. But I couldn't find a way to solve this problem. The solution emerged in January of 2016 when a former banking colleague of mine introduced me to two developers in blockchain. I had just had my first child 7 weeks ago, and they came over to my house, and I asked my mum to come over and help look after my daughter Emily so I could have this meeting. I had only really heard about the blockchain notionally at that point in terms of the Bitcoin, but it sparked my interest, and I started to look into its potential applications within the electricity sector. And I saw this technology could do exactly what was needed in my apartment building. It was a way to split the bill and pass around the incentives without the headaches. A bit like when you go to a restaurant with your friends and some people drink 2 bottles of wine and others drink none, and you either have to fiddle over the bill at the end, which is tedious, or pay a lot more, and it's not really a dinner you want to go to all that often. The blockchain made this very simple and made people accountable for what they were using, all the while paying back the extra investment in panels and batteries. This would hopefully encourage landlords, owner-occupiers and developers to install them. It would be a win-win for everybody. The tenants and owner-occupiers get lower cost, lower carbon electricity. The apartment blocks get the solar investment, which means a revenue stream for the owner. The developer may get lower headworks charges for electricity infrastructure, and they also get a product that's more appealing, which can sell faster. So an enhanced return on investment, and the planet gets the reduced CO2 footprint. Anyway, when we tried the energy trading platform in the apartment, people really loved it. We ran a more developed trial in Busselton, south of Perth, and you could feel the strength of the appetite for what we were doing. The next question was going to be, what happens when you take this out of an apartment and into the country as a whole? What would happen next? As villages and cities started to trade electricity, you create a bottom-up electricity grid rather than a top-down one or a centralised system. You could get more stable electricity prices, which don't keep going up above the cost of inflation. One that is perhaps less dependent on high-cost, high-voltage transmission pylons. The system will also be more resilient because pylons can be susceptible to hurricanes and outages. And by the very nature of it not being centralised, a microgrid can withstand a lot more. We're predicting we'll see a natural uptake of the various components of the system growing organically throughout the region in Australia and internationally. PV cells, batteries, inverters, all building a microgrid. These microgrids could multiply and coalesce into other microgrids to make a bigger microgrid set, much like the way the internet market shifted around 94, 95. My guess is that it will grow like many distributed networks in the future. It could be a non-coercive and non-taxational way to approach energy markets. I also discovered that the law... Oh, sorry, pardon me. So that's quite a big idea, and I'm glad to be playing a part in it. As I said, the work is in progress and we still have much to do. So, but I would like to take a moment of pause and share some of the things I've learned to date. The first is that creating a market is an extremely powerful thing to do. You can run around trying to fix problems, but creating a market that will fix things is even better. For one thing, markets admit women in an interesting way. The car market woke up to the fact that most of the purchasing decisions around cars are made by women and adjusted itself accordingly. And of course, markets prevent essentially a communist iron curtain way of managing resources. We may think we've got a market in electricity and water and a few other things, but essentially it's managed economy stuff. As my old professor, Peter Newman, pointed out, our utilities management would not feel unfamiliar to Stalin. The second thing I learned was the value of finding a small, clearly defined problem that needs solving in an innovative way. The third thing I learned was the importance of being able to articulate that idea clearly. If your idea has a major bump or a hole in it, investors are going to spot that in the first 15 minutes. 15 seconds actually. So you've got to get clear about an idea or be prepared to throw it away and work on something else. There are lots of people I've seen along the way who've got projects that don't have any clarity about them, and the likelihood is they won't ever amount to much. Yes, there's talk of crypto this and blockchain that, and you've got all the trappings of a good tech project, but when you look at them closely and interrogate them a bit, maybe get them to write a white paper, you don't find very much. It's all smoke and mirrors and stuff that crumbles into nothing. That kind of project ultimately won't have the traction that's needed to become successful. The next thing for success, I think, is to leverage your network. When Power Ledger was trying to sell our cryptocurrency in October last year, the Power token, prior to that I had a really good run of luck that started with meeting a fabulous entrepreneur in the tech space called Bill Tai. He was attached to Curtin University as an innovator in residence and also ran West Tech Fest, which he had founded. When Power Ledger launched its ICO, I asked him if we could be our ambassador and advisor. Bill had previously said no to all such requests, but I think he saw a parallel in what we're doing and what had happened in the 90s with the internet, an area that he'd worked in, blowing it wide open with some entrepreneurship, and he said yes. He could understand our project and see a clear value reason to use the blockchain, all of which meant it had validity in his eyes. Now, Bill is good friends with Sir Richard Branson, and he was going to Branson's Necker Island for the annual blockchain conference in July of 2017, which they had co-founded together. Anyway, I realised a trip to this conference was exactly what our project needed. Necker Island would have lots of super hot tech contacts with know-how. The trouble was, it was full up. Then a woman delegate pulled out 48 hours before the conference started, and a space became available for a woman. And I suppose this is where being a woman is both easy and difficult. The trouble was, I was breastfeeding my daughter Emily, and anyway, it was 4 flights and 37 hours away, a mission that was going to cost $20,000. Power Ledger had $70,000 in the bank at that point. I said to Bill, I can't go because I'm knee-deep in nappies and a breastfeeding schedule, but I'll send our CEO, Dave Martin. Dave thought, whoopee, I'd love to go. But then Bill said, it's you or I'll get another woman. They were aiming for a strict 50% men and women at this conference. Well, eventually, I got myself and my baby Emily to Necker Island, and with the hindsight, I'm glad I did. 2 months afterwards, I picked up $4 million of investment from the people there. It's safe to say it made our initial coin offering. What would have happened if I hadn't been, would that have happened if I hadn't been female? Probably not. So there's a woman's story to be found in my Power Ledger tale. It's probably this. Although it's a man's world, the tech industry loves women. And I have to say, the quality of conversations we had there benefited hugely because of the female influence. It's difficult to put into words what that actually was, but somehow the mix felt more fresh and more dynamic, and more representative of the actual marketplace, which includes both men and women, strangely enough. So for me, having men and women provided the full spectrum of perspectives and input to make more sophisticated things happen. Notwithstanding the Necker Island factor, I believe because of this, it was the most exciting conference that I've ever been to. So I want to sum up what I've learned from this, which is really what's worked for me. Firstly, you need to follow some passion. Trying to reform the bins at my bank was a hiding to nothing, but it came from a real need to make a difference. You need to create a mission focus. That usually means a strong concept at the heart of it. Once we'd coined the term democratisation of power, people from all sorts of places started to get emotionally involved in what we were doing. That became an X factor that others working in the same vein did not have. Next, a big concept can reside in something quite small. It just needs a little extra help to come out of its shell. That concept needs to be clear and communicable. A market is an extremely powerful thing to create. It can do things you and many others cannot. You cannot force people to do very much at all, but with the right incentives, people will do anything. And when you've got your concept, allow your network to enjoy it and develop it, which is the last couple of things I would like to share with you. Find yourself ambassadors and mentors. Bill Tai has been amazing as an inspiration at many points. You need to find your Bill Tai, and probably more than one of them throughout your career, which I've had. And when you do, they'll help you bring your concept to their network. Mission focus plus network equals rainmaking. Many people ask, how do I do all the things that I do? And the answer is that I don't. I have a lot of support, a nanny, a husband and a mum that all do a great deal. In 2015, when I was 7 months pregnant with my first child, I ran as an independent counsellor at the City of Perth. I did that because I wanted to play a part in making Perth more livable and to help in economic diversification. Although it asked a lot of me and those around me, it was easy in comparison to accidentally becoming the Deputy Lord Mayor. A week later, I found out I was pregnant with our second child, and I've been very sick during this pregnancy. I did discover my limits in this process. You can do most things in life, but not all at the same time. Back to the Lao Tzu quote, the longest journey always starts with the smallest step. You don't know where any career journey will take you, but it's probably roughly in the direction of the smallest step. Faraday showing Gladstone that generator was just a small step. He didn't know what it was going to take him at that stage. They had no idea of the national electricity grid then, but he sensed something bigger. For our part, we've got some quite big steps to achieve in the next few years. We have to get some legislative changes. We need help to get our platform in some of the islands in the Caribbean where their electricity is insecure, dirty and diesel-based and expensive. And then transform everywhere that isn't an island. And once we've done that, I'll come back to you and tell you what success really looks like. I hope my journey has been interesting for you and helps you to look at your smallest steps and ask where they're really leading you. As I mentioned at the beginning, there hasn't been a massive event that's decided how my life was, and perhaps that's an access point for you. Start with something small and build on that. You may surprise yourself, as I did, with where it leads you. Thank you.
And I'm sure you've got lots of questions. I, for one, finally understand blockchain now. It's been explained in wine, so that's really good. But has anyone in the audience got a question they'd like to ask? Oh, extreme shyness. Jump in. I'll start picking on people. You know? Travis.
I think I've heard you mention in past at an event around the stress that came with the ICO and what followed. There were some stakeholder issues. Would you be able to, I found that interesting, so I thought it'd be worth sharing.
Sure. So we had two parts to our initial point offering, which is that we created a cryptocurrency called the Power Token, and we sold, we made 1 billion units of this currency, and we sold about 1/3 of it to the market. And the cryptocurrency does a particular thing. It acts as a license to, could I get some water? Thanks. I might just sit down if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so the Power Token acts as a license to transact peer-to-peer, and in electricity markets, market participants need to put up a credential, which is essentially a bond for buying and selling electricity in the market. In the event that they don't pay, this money is used to pay the people that owe them. And the Power Token performs the same function on the blockchain. And so we sold 1/3 of the 1 billion tokens, and we did it in two parts. The first part was what we call the pre-sale, and the second part was the main sale. In the pre-sale, the price was fixed at 8.8 cents per token or per unit of currency. And in the second part, it was an auction. And the auction went for 4 weeks. And so you didn't know in week 1, 2 or 3 what the price was going to be at the end of week 4. And during the course of weeks 1, 2 and 3, the price was lower than in the price of the pre-sale. And many people that had purchased tokens in the pre-sale were very angry and upset that they essentially had, in their view, paid more than the main sale. And they were getting very angry with us. And I even received some death threats because of this. I had to kind of remain calm and also ask these people to kind of let us complete the sale and sort of reserve their judgment until the end. But during this process with all this vitriol and hatred, something inside me kind of clicked. I call it the retaliative response, but there might have been some expletives included in it. And I just decided I'm going to show you. And so I went about really driving the sale in the main sale. And in the last week, we pulled in about $5 or $6 million, and the main sale price closed quite a good amount above the pre-sale price. But yeah, it was a very trying time. And at one point, during that process, I was sat on the bathroom floor at my house for about 9 hours inside this kind of chat room with about 15,000 people in it who were like berating me. And I think I got a lot of iris on my thumbs from it as well. My mum and my husband were a bit worried about me, but I was just so focused on dealing with this particular issue and showing them.
Right, we might switch the format, so if you've got a question, it'd be great if you could kind of stand up so we can see you.
Oh dear.
I know, right? I just threw you under the bus there. Go on. We can see you.
Good. There's been a few pieces written in the media recently about the fact that if you're a successful woman or a high-profile woman and you haven't experienced any discrimination or gender bias toward you in forging your career, that it doesn't exist. And that concept is sort of perpetuated by women having that view. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, well, as a researcher, I don't really rely on sample sizes of 1.
Sure.
But, I mean, I think that it's great that they haven't had that experience, but I wouldn't suggest that is the norm. And I wouldn't, my personal experience, but also in those around me, and also understanding what the research shows in Western Australia, we're some of the worst performers, like nationally, in terms of gender equality and opportunity and equal treatment of women in the workforce. So I think that the statistics really speak for themselves, notwithstanding anyone's individual experience.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Cool. Questions?
Yes, please. Given your positive experience with quotas, obviously with the island, what do you feel about political quotas? The need for political quotas?
I think you could essentially put some other types of quotas in. For example, when you're interviewing people, that you actually interview 50% men and women. And I think that you might have to put more effort into actually getting those women, into the interview table. And if you just go to the usual means of hiring people, the same actions are going to derive the same outcomes. So it might be more effort to do that, but you're actually creating a level playing field in the assessment process. So I think as a first step, it could be beneficial to require, half women and half men in most sectors in the evaluation process, and to put them up against each other. So I think that could make a big difference as well. I didn't feel like, for example, on Necker Island, I mean, myself excluded, that we got the B team with the women. I felt like they were just as accomplished in life, but they had to put more effort into getting those women and finding them and identifying them. So I think that the same sort of rule of thumb applies for other things around gender equality.
One more now. Thank you.
I can hope you remember me.
Yes, hi.
Thank you, and congratulations for the second one.
Thank you.
And in your speaking about, you said you mentioned than he invented. And looking back, you got more leadership skills now. So how you do to make people accepting your idea, be happy, not become the most hated people in the office?
Well, you could have tied performance bonuses to a floor to better recycling metrics and created incentive programs.